All right. You can see my mouse. All right, apparently I was muted, so there's a lot of issue for the Zoom people. Sorry, I'm not going to repeat everything I said. So we've had a lot of issues. I've been here since 10 trying to fix it. There's 5 people working on it. It hasn't worked. So I apologize for the people on Zoom. There is a lag with the slideshow, and also you're not seeing my slides in full slideshow mode. And we don't know why, but we are seeing it in slideshow mode here. So apologize. Anyway, I was introducing myself, and I was saying that the XPRIZE Rainforest was a big team effort with a lot of people from Mila. Chris, who I see in the back. Hi, Chris. So Chris has been a huge help for this competition, and also got a lot of people in his team to help, and people from David Rolnick's team as well. So Hugo Beauchamp, Arthur Waknin, Mélisande, Martin, Matthew, Michel, Yuyan, and many other people that contributed ideas and over the months of this competition. Yeah. All right, so I think the people are trying to.
Yeah, sorry. So this is your screen sharing laptop now.
Okay,
sorry
great.
about the issues.
Sorry, we're trying to fix
this laptop here, and it's working.
From this one.
Yeah.
Okay, but I should do both.
Yeah, and then you should just go into Google. Sorry,
I'll just do both. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I need to stop sharing this one.
No, it's fine. You can do both if you want. It's just now you could also just go on Google Meet on your laptop, and it's just gonna follow.
But do I stop this one?
Yeah. And then just tab to go to Meet.
I'll tab to go to Meet. I think I'll just do both. Okay.
Yeah,
There's been enough issues. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So the XPRIZE Rainforest was a 5-year competition. It started in 2019. It was a big, $10 million competition. And XPRIZE, if you don't know, it's a foundation that organizes a lot of competition to solve big problems. There's one right now is the finals on carbon removal technology. This one was about the rainforest, and more specifically, it was about developing new technologies to enhance the monitoring of biodiversity in tropical rainforests, because tropical rainforests are disappearing at a faster rate that we can actually study them. And so the competition was designed that we had to survey 100 hectares, so that's like roughly 100 football field or something, or baseball fields of tropical forest, but we only had 24 hours, so only one day to survey the forest with new technology, and we only had 2 days after the 24 hours to write a full report on all the biodiversity we monitor, and also to generate insights about the standing value of these forests. But one tricky thing is we're not actually allowed to physically enter the forest, and so everything had to be done remotely using drones or other technologies. All right, I'll play a quick video. I'm not sure if it will work here. It might not. Who knows? Let's try. And I'm just going to talk through as I'm showing it. Okay. So for the people on Zoom, it doesn't seem to be working. Apologies. Anyway, for the people in the room, so what you're seeing is that we actually designed a raft that we would deliver under trees. And this raft had a lot of devices to record. It had microphones to record the bird sounds. It had camera traps to acquire photos of insects. It was also acquiring insects, like capturing insects for DNA, because we did some DNA sequencing. And then there were lights on the raft. It would attract insects at night. The insects would actually land on the whiteboard, and there was machine learning models, detection model, and classification models. And one of the cool things that we did with bioacoustics as well is that we recorded birds and could identify the species, but as the birds were moving around, we could actually track them. And this is the part that we did that I'm going to talk a little bit more about after, is we segmented, detected trees, and tried to identify them. And one of the things as well that the team did for environmental DNA, it's really important to get water sample. And so we're able to physically locate, a little water puddle in the forest and filter 40 liters of water through it so that we could retrieve it and then go and get the DNA from it and amplify it and sequence it and so on, so that we could we could get a lot of species information from the DNA. There was a full lab in the jungle, right on the beach. People were working all night to try to get DNA samples. And yeah, so it was a huge team effort, as you can imagine. All right. I'm just going to skip here. Okay, how did this start? This started with 2 people from Outreach Robotics. This is a really innovative startup from University of Sherbrooke and robotics. And what they do is, they design, robots for environmental sampling. So I knew them from 2019 because we had done a project together where, they had designed this leaf sampling tool with a drone. And at the time, we were doing some remote sensing and vegetation work, and we needed physical samples. And so we worked with them in 2019. It was actually the start of the competition. And neither of us knew at the time that we were participate a few years later in this competition, because Outreach Robotics was not initially part of the team. They were invited later on. I'm just going to move this here. They were invited in 2023 to join the XPRIZE team, one of the semifinalist team, to do the semifinals in Singapore because they had not, they didn't have any robotics people on the team. And so they designed a raft, and they advanced through finals, which was fantastic. And after that, they contacted me because they knew me. And the problem at the time in the semifinals is that they had no one that was doing vegetation. And, it was a rainforest competition. There are a lot of trees there. And so they contacted me. And at the time, we had this grant with Chris, David, Oliver Sonnentag from geography, and Anne Bruno from my department. And it was funded by Ivado. And we're actually underspending at the time with this grant. And so we had money left over. And I reached out to Chris, David, and all the others. Chris was really enthusiastic. So let's go and let's get into this competition and win this thing. So like, all right, let's do it. And so we had an idea how to do it because we had been working, on this problem for temperate forests and boreal forests and other forests in Canada. This problem of, segmenting individual trees, trying to classify them to species and things like that. We even published a data set that you can all access. And this data set is actually of tediously labeled hand-drawn trees. There's 23,000 of them. And this is published, and it's actually been used by Mila people to do some ML research. So we sort of knew how to do this. And Arthur, who's here, is my co-founder, who also have a startup, a Mila startup called Rubisco AI. And, we're really focused more on monitoring forest restoration project. And at the time, we had this proof of concept that we could segment individual trees. And so we thought, well, we have a good idea here. Let's just try to apply it to the rainforest. But the problem, of course, is that we didn't have any data. And so, we needed really a lot of data from tropical forests to be able to train our models to perform well in this new context. And so this is the team lead, Tom, who's very energetic, and he's been working in Ecuador for the last 30 years. And he told me, all right, I'll learn how to fly a drone. Just ship me a drone and we'll go get some data. I'm like, okay. So, next week, I just sent him a drone to Colorado, a little mini drone that we use usually for teaching because I didn't want him to crash our big drone. So we said, okay, Tom, just go out there and see what you can do. And so I trained him. He went to Ecuador and started acquiring data. And actually, the data that turned out was pretty good. And so we were pretty enthusiastic. And Tom being Tom, he made a lot of contact with other people, and he contacted Gonzalo Rivas Torres, who's the station director of Tiputini in Ecuador in the Amazon. And this is probably one of the biological stations that has the most tree biodiversity in the world. In 800 hectares, you have over 1,200 tree species. So it's a really fascinating place. And Gonzalo flies drone. He had a drone. And so he acquired a lot of data for us and was very instrumental in this whole in this whole competition. So this is where Tiputini is. It's it sits at the foot of the tropical Andes, and this is the place where there's the highest tree biodiversity in the world, because that's where you meet these two really important ecosystems, the mountains and the start of the Amazon. And this is a hotspot for evolution of tree species biodiversity. So we were working there, and this is what the station looks like. You see the boats there, the blue boats at the top. This is where we we land and drop our gear after a 6-hour trip in the Amazon. And Gonzalo had been flying drone for years, and so we had already access to imagery from this area, and we also acquired more. But one thing that Gonzalo did, because he knows the trees pretty well, and that was a huge effort, is he manually labeled individual trees, and he knew the species he could identify from the imagery anyway. And so that was a huge hand labeling effort. One of the problems, though, with this data set, and this is something that the problem became more apparent later on the competition, is that when you label imagery and you try to identify species from such imagery, you don't get enough detail to really get the features that you would need to identify most species. And so you can only really identify the species that are very visually distinct, such as palm trees. You see the little dots here. And so Gonzalo identified a lot of palms, which was great for identifying palms, but not so great for identifying all the other species out there. And so we only had a few months really to get ready for this competition. So we had to be really opportunistic. And so Tom, the XPRIZE lead, made another contact with a station called ZF2 near Manaus in Brazil. This is also a hotspot of activity for research in tropical forests. And so, so we start working with some students there who are already doing some forest surveys and drone work. And a little bit later on, we sent Antoine and Hugo. Antoine is my chief pilot in my lab. He comes to Mila once in a while. Hugo is now a master's student at Mila in Chris' lab. And at the time, we had hired him as an employee before his master's. And Carolyn here that you see works at ZF2. She's a forest engineer, and so she helped with the forest surveys. But initially, it was really, really tedious, really painstaking work, because these guys were used to do forest surveys from the ground, right? I mean, you walk in the forest, and so, this is sort of, oh, sorry, so this is just a photo, I'll just skip that one. But you see there's just a road that goes through, and if you want to identify trees, you have to just basically go straight in the jungle and then, move around and try to locate that tree and the stem and try to identify it. And then you need to relate it to the imagery. So it's very, very difficult. And so what we came up with during the, last few months of the competition is to get a workflow where we would first, do something like this, where we would image and then we'd detect and segment the trees, which was, quite a lot of work, but we made it work. But what we did after is, because we know the precise location and both in X, Y, and also the elevation of each tree, we designed a workflow that you could send the drone back to a particular tree and take a really detailed close-up photo of that tree that would really help the botanist to identify the species. And so this is an example of what those photos look like. And I'd like to ask someone from the room that does a bit of gardening would have any idea what sort of tree this could be? Looking maybe at the flower. Any guess? No guess? So this nice purple flower, it doesn't remind you of an eggplant flower? This is actually like an eggplant tree that's 25, 30 meter tall. So it's in the genus Solanum, and the station director was super excited because he had never seen such a large one. Sometimes you see them as, sub canopy tree, and they're quite small. There you go. There was an emergent tree that produced really tiny little eggplants, as you can see. I mean, it's not really an eggplant, it's a Solanum tree species, but I like to call it the eggplant tree anyway. So with these images, they're so good in terms of image quality that the botanists see this and they're like, wow, this is almost as good as a herbarium specimen. And so they can, pretty reliably give a species identification. And because we know the precise location of that photo, we can use it as training data for our segmented trees, knowing that this is the species that we're looking for. I'm not going to go into detail, but Hugo, who we hired at the time, Hugo Beauchamp, made this really interesting architecture, and the whole pipeline for mapping the trees sort of looks a little bit like that. It has different modules, and the first step is to detect the individual trees using a tree detector. And then there's some post-processing. I'm not going to go into detail, but then these boxes are used as prompts, box prompts for a segmentation for the segment anything algorithm. And then once we know the tree, then we can use another model to extract some features, to get embeddings, and then we use these for clustering. And the hope was that these clusters would represent like actual species, even if we don't know what the species are. And then we would take these close-up photos to identify the tree. And we had tried models, like for example, this is BioClip, and this is on a red oak, like red oak tree that you find around here, and works pretty well for red oak. But the problem is, as we found out, is that it doesn't work very well at all for most tropical trees because there's just not a whole lot of data out there. One of the things we did in the competition, and I think that's why we got our model to work as well as it did, is in my team, we're pretty used to do labeling on drone imagery. We've hired a bunch of students, a lot of people to just hand-drawn boxes around trees. And we did this in Ecuador, we did this in Brazil, we did this in Panama, we did this also in forest that we image around here. This is kind of what it looks like when you zoom in. And over the course of a few months, we collected over 55,000 new boxes of tropical trees, and this is more than an order of magnitude more than the published data for tropical trees that were out there. So, and now we're at over 100,000, I think. So, because we still continued after the competition, so we have a pretty large data set now. Hugo Arthur is involved as well, is now pushing the research in terms of trying to get this data out there as well as the models. What we used after is we used, as I said, the segment anything model. I'm not going to go into detail. If you want to learn more about segmentation of tree, Mélisande in the background is there. She devoted a whole study of her PhD thesis on that. But this model, short story, as you can see in the image, it works relatively well. So one of the things Hugo did as well is, to get, and Yu Yan and David's lab helped for that, is we said, okay, how are we going to, get a clustering algorithm that works for tropical trees? And so what we tried to use a triplet network, and where we'd have a tree from the same, two trees from the same species, or a tree from not the same species. And then we trained a model. But one of the problems, as I alluded to earlier, is that we had a lot of palm trees. And so, yeah, our data was sort of overrepresented in terms of palms. But anyway, we still tried it. And when we were applying, this approach to data sets that we already had, like, for example, in Ecuador or in Quebec, and if you plot the embeddings of these, each point now would be in individual trees, you would see that it would create clusters that sort of were distinctive enough, I guess. But the problem is, when we got to the competition, unfortunately, it was not as pretty as that. Another constraint for the competition is that, you had to think that 3 days was in the middle of the Amazon. And so even though we brought Starlink, like, we could not rely on Starlink for processing. And so what we did is we bought the biggest gaming computer we could find and brought it to the Amazon, hoping that it would work. One of the things during the practice, it actually reached almost boiling point. You could probably boil tea on the computer, because imagine that computer is running full speed and it's 35 degrees outside with 90% humidity. And so it didn't like it, but actually it survived, and it did work. The Wi-Fi card broke or was damaged, but anyway, it came back to life later on, so everything's good. So that was kind of a constraint, and we made it work. This is where the competition was. So Manaus is, it's like central Amazon in Brazil. If you know this area, this is a really cool area, because as you can see from this image, this is where the Rio Negro and the Amazon meet, and they have very different sources in terms of where the water comes from. One of them is more from the Guiana Shield, and one of them is more from, sediments from the Andes. And so they have very different chemistry. You can see from the color, and then they merge in Manaus, and they actually, the two bodies of water don't mix for a while. And you have this, this river where it is black on the north and it's sort of brown on the south. Anyway, so the competition was, the 100 hectare was where that star was, and this is where we were sent. And this is what our imagery looks like from the competition. It was pretty good. The only problem is it's super sunny. I mean, sun, it's a rainforest, so it's sunny sometimes. But when it's sunny, the image has more shadows and it's a little bit harder, but we could still make it work. All of the teams had the same sun conditions. So our algorithm worked pretty well for the detection and the segmentation. This is sort of what it looks like. So the trees, we're able to segment 22,000 trees in the 100 hectare. And we also had something where we could, looking at the size of the crown, we could infer the carbon or the biomass that was stored in the trees. And then we estimated there's about 3,000 tons of carbon stored above ground in these 22,000 trees. Now, the colors are not colors from the cluster. This is actually, we ended up using at the last minute Dino V2, the embeddings, and then I plotted that in RGB space just to show like the, how visually dissimilar the trees were, but we could not really make clusters that work because this is what we got with our triplet network. It was just like a cluster of palms, a cluster of like white trees with white flowers, and then there's this massive group of all the other trees that was red. And so it was not very useful for the competition. What we did get, though, is that we still get the height of every single tree. And so we were still able to send a drone back to get, images that look a little bit like that. And these images through Starlink were actually sent to a botanist who was providing human identification, like real time. We also tried BioClip in the competition with pretty mixed success, really, but we still tried it. And this is what we did. We were able, in the 24 hours, because actually we had to do a lot of other stuff, not just take close-up photos. And the 24-hour included, the night between. So it started at noon, and so we could not do any imagery at night. And the days are not as long as they are in our summer. But still, we were able to collect 100 photos from 118 trees. And we would have liked to ID more, but the botanist could only identify 57 of those. I've now improved our photo acquisition so that the photos are a little bit better, and I think the botanist would have been able to do a better job, but still, that's what we could do. One of the challenges that we had in this competition, and it's not something that we anticipated, but actually we made a big contribution to that, is that we were supposed, every team thought there's gonna be standing water, and all of the eDNA work was geared towards finding water, because when you filter water, you get a lot of DNA, and then you can get a lot of sequence, and then you can get a lot of species and so on. But this is what the forest looked like when we imaged it. And so the first thing, and we processed the imagery in a couple hours, and they're like, where's the water? They had this big expensive drone and a full DNA lab waiting for the water. And so there was a lot of pressure, and we're like, well, there's no water. Anyway, we could not see any. But luckily, with the digital surface model we can do, it was pretty obvious that there was a low spot in the bottom, sort of bottom left section. And so we're like, well, let's go and try to find what we can find there. But when you looked at the imagery, it was full of shadow, so you could not really see. So we sent the drone back with the zoom camera that we used to take the close-up photo at every single one of these canopy gaps. We just went and tried to find water. And eventually, and the whole team was like, well, Antoine, who's my chief pilot, managed to find water. And as soon as he found it, they sent the drone back to collect the 40 liters of water and brought it back. So that was a big success. Anyway, we won the competition, which was great. I'm not going to say this is because just of our canopy tree mapping. I think it was a big component. And the judges did mention that it was really innovative and so on, and potentially transformative. But there was a lot of other things that we did in our team, and the eDNA work was actually a big part of it. The insect work as well was quite innovative, and the judges really liked that. But as soon as the competition ended, I was like, okay, this competition was great, but it was just an excuse to get people like you at Mila and some people, excited about this so that we could advance this. And then I turned back to the science, and I'm an associate at Smithsonian in Panama, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which is in Panama. But they also have this station in the middle of the Panama Canal called Barro Colorado Island. And this is probably, you see the rectangle there is a 50-hectare plot that started in the 80s, and it's probably the most intensively studied piece of forest on Earth. But really what they're interested in is to, go beyond the 50-hectare plot. And Helene, my collaborator there, she wants to map, the entire island, which is 1,500 hectare. And so I'm like, okay, I think we can do that. So we've been working with them since. This is an example of us working. Of course, right now we just do small blocks. We also have worked with another team who has a drone that can actually fly the entire island, but this is just an example of what it looks like now. We get pretty good images of the forest, and then, we can run our detection and segmentation algorithm. That works pretty well for most trees, especially the largest ones. And these are the ones that a lot of people are interested in because they're actually hard to study, the trees that are very high. And and these are the reds are actually where we send the drone back to take a close-up photo, so we can get the really precise location of these photos. And this is what we look like. They look like. And then we're sending this. We're working with a team of botanists from the Smithsonian, local botanists who are identifying, the thousands of species, trees that we're photographing. Another thing that's pretty cool is that this can really advance science, because right now, today actually, Avarice, which is the big, super expensive NASA aircraft that has hyperspectral and LiDAR sensor, is flying above BCI right now, and all the sections of central Panama. And this sort of work where we can really get the trees, identify the species, is like the best possible ground truth, or I like to call it canopy truth, data that it can use to then infer, make like really large scale maps of tropical tree species, for example. And so this is very exciting how the work that we're doing can actually help much larger initiatives. Another project that will really benefit from that is, so I was emailing Evan this morning. Dr. Evan Gore is at the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies, but he's a fellow at the Smithsonian. He's been studying for years the impact of lightning, and it's really cool what they do. They actually are able to locate where a lightning strike lands, and they actually go and see the tree where it lands. And he's using drones to look at the large trees. And what they found is that, well, first of all, the 1% of the largest trees store half of the biomass, so half of the carbon of the forest. So they play a really important role in terms of carbon sequestration in these ecosystems. But 40% of the cause of mortality of these large trees is lightning. And so they were able to demonstrate that. And so what that means is that, if climate changes, which it is, and lightning frequency and the severity and so on of a thunderstorm changes, this can have a really big impact, not just on population dynamics of these trees, but also the carbon that they store. And so they're expanding now in other places in the tropics to try to expand that work. And they're very excited about the work that we're doing because they can locate and know what species of trees it is and so on. All right, so another story that emerged from this is us in Rio at the ceremony for the award. But there's these bird guides, so they're Quechua people from Ecuador, and Tom has been working with them for a long time. They're bird guides, but they created this company as part of the XPRIZE called Selvatech, and they want to offer more biomonitoring services. And so one of the things that they wanted to do is to fly drones. So after the competition, we went down to Ecuador actually in January to train these guys on how to use the drone, how to use their workflow. We spent 4 days with them, and now they're flying drones in all sorts of places now around Ecuador, at Tiputini, where they're climbing this tower to fly the drone at the very top of this tower that's hooked on a kapok tree that's 500 years old. And then when you reach to the summit, you have a beautiful view of the forest. And so the drone, you don't have any signal issue because you're really high up. And so you can acquire a lot of data. And in this place, there's probably hundreds of tree species that have yet to be described or maybe even discovered. So this is really quite interesting. All right, next steps. So what are we doing with this? And maybe because this is a Mila talk, I focused a little bit on the ML research. There's lots of things we can do. Of course, right now we're using this pipeline to acquire a lot of data because at the end of the day, without the really high quality data, it's hard to make really good advances in terms of the ML. But we are acquiring the data. We already have quite a lot, but we're acquiring more in terms of the species. So there's different things we're working on with various people, some in the room, Arthur, Mélisande, and I'm not seeing, well, Chris, of course, and David, and their lab, and different people in their lab. So this idea of training forest foundation models and pre-training large models with RGB imagery, but also point clouds to enhance or improve downstream tasks. Hugo is working, and Arthur as well, in improving the detection and the segmentation. Mélisande is working on that. We need more data to try again this triplet network approach or other approaches. We need to try some clustering approaches. And also one of the big things is that we're always in the situation where we have a lot of unlabeled imagery, but we have very few labels. So we need to think of clever ways to make the most of very little data. One of the approaches that we're trying as well is there are not a lot of close-up images that are identified to species of tropical trees, but there's a huge wealth of digitized herbarium specimens out there, which look very different from close-up photos, but in a way there's still leaves pressed on the piece of cardboard and so on. And so there could be some really interesting cross-domain adaptation with herbarium specimen, maybe leverage this wealth of information. We're looking at that as well. We want to do better to estimate the height of the trees as well as the carbon they contain, because this is very important to understand how much biomass is stored in these really important forests. It might be really interesting as well to think of projects eventually to try to detect and find new species, because in these tropical forests, there's a lot of undescribed species. So how can we fly the drone around to locate those really different trees or anomalous trees that we can maybe send the drone back to get a photo and maybe even a sample, because I showed you early on that we also have a leaf sampling device that we could use. And of course, all of this research, we want to use it to improve tropical forest science, but also conservation and the restoration of these forests. And so, yeah, I apologize again for all the glitches with the Zoom. There's nothing I could do about it. We tried for half an hour, so sorry, but for the people in the room, thanks for your patience. And yeah, this whole project has been really great because of the people. Working with different people, working with people at Mila, and I'm really hoping, because what I'm seeing, I'm more of a domain expert. I'm an ecologist, so I interact with a lot of people, and you wouldn't believe the amount of interest, because these type of technologies can really transform how we study ecosystems, especially in the tropics where it's so difficult to work. So everyone is so excited. And also the people in conservation groups. I'm meeting Conservation International this afternoon. There's lots of conservation organizations that are interested in this work. So I just want to say that the people that, you guys that work on algorithms and models, there's a lot of potential for the research that you do to have real world immediate impact on biodiversity conservation. And if some of you are interested in that, please come talk to me. And thanks for your, thank you.
Right, so if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and I'll get the mic to you.
Could you explain briefly what features each team had to provide for the competition? Like, for me, it wasn't that clear.
Oh, okay, so there were 6 finalist teams. Actually, the competition is very open-ended. So the only objective was the team that would win would provide in 24 hours, as well as the 2 days after the competition where we'd process the data, the most accurate biodiversity observations. That could be anything like an insect species or even a family or a bird or a tree, or like as much information about the biodiversity of the forest. And then the other thing was, what do you do with the data? So any insights, but that was very open-ended. It could be anything. So they left it. So for us, for the trees, it was, things like how many species per hectare do you find? Are there some unusual species of particular high value for conservation or species of cultural importance? Collectively, how much carbon do these trees store and things like that? So any insights that would help managers or people to understand the value of this of a forest that's standing. It's pretty easy to calculate the value of a forest that's cut down, and you cut it and and you calculate the timber value of that. But it's very hard to quantify the value of a forest that's standing, and so that's what we had to do.
So from a deep learning perspective, what was brought to the competition was the crown delineation, and then the embedding didn't work. in the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah, so I guess, it was a competition, so they didn't really care about the most fancy, they cared about the results. And so, we could not treat it as a 2-year research projects, because when we actually only had a few months. And so there's different innovations, I think. First of all, the detection is not a really fancy detector, but we collected a lot of data, and now we're sitting on data that could really help. So we help, big innovation on the data side for the detection. The combination of the detector and segment anything is not super innovative, but it was neat from an engineering side. And then the classification and the clustering, I think it could be innovative. It's just that we didn't have enough data to really show the potential of this approach for this competition. But I think everything that has to do with the species side of thing, because there's 65,000 tree species on Earth. Most of them are in the tropics. And in the tropics, there's a huge bias in terms of where the data is. There's lots of data for temperate tree species. There's very little for tropical tree species. And so I think there's still a lot of innovation to be done on that front, and we could only get so far in the competition, but we're still working on it.
And did you guys continue this project, like the classification, et cetera, for this data or for that region afterwards? Or is it like you worked in different?
Yeah, so at the moment, I think there's 2 main projects that are, sort of formal. I mean, there's a lot of people that are interested in this general. So Hugo Beauchamp, who's a master's student in Chris Lab, is really interested in pursuing. He has a lot of interesting ideas on how we can, but I think there's probably lots of different projects in this sort of overall theme. And I have a master's student, Carol Altimas, who comes to Mila every week, so maybe you'll bump into her at some point. She's really interested in this cross-domain adaptation with the herbarium specimens. I've not shown photos of the herbarium specimens, but to try to learn, how do we learn, sort of joint representations between a close-up photo of a tree and a herbarium specimen. And if that's successful, then hopefully we can, from the close-up photo, do a much better job at identifying tree species. So these are the 2 projects that we're doing now, but there's lots of room, I think, for other projects.
Hi. So I have a question about the exciting events around finding the water and getting that water. So presumably it's kind of hidden by the canopy. So can you fly a drone in there easily, or does that take some kind of drone racing expert to navigate around all the branches and stuff?
Yeah, good question. Finding water is something that was pretty unusual for the competition. We don't often are looking for water under forest, but I think you would need, FPV style going through it's probably doable. I think it's very likely you'll crash a drone in this because it's super dense with lianas and all sorts of stuff under the canopy. So I think technically it could probably be done. The far easier approach, which we didn't do in this competition, but we often do around here, is you can have a LiDAR unit, and LiDAR will go through the canopy, and then you can map the ground. And from the ground, you might not see directly the water, but you will definitely see where the puddles are and the streams and so on. And so that would have given us a much better idea where the water is. But it was intentional that we didn't use LiDAR in the competition, because LiDAR is 10 times more expensive than these small drones. And we wanted to, part of this, the goal of this competition was to create technology that could then be used by conservation agencies, and they cannot afford $50,000 drones, but they might be able to afford like a few $1,000s for a drone. So everything was built on just the RGB imagery, but LiDAR could have found it for sure.
So the person who was flying the drone was able to just like navigate down through the canopy to get that.
Yeah. So okay. So to find the water. Sorry, we didn't go through the canopy. So we just flew above, but we have a zoom camera. And so we could see there was standing water going.
Yeah.
If you zoom in, like we could see the water. And as soon as we saw, okay, this place, so we had the precise coordinate of that. And then they sent the big drone back that had a winch, and this, and this water sampling device was actually like a modified Pelican case with a pump and so on inside. And it was hooked with a metal cable with a winch on the much bigger drone. And so they just delivered that straight through that gap and just filtered the water.
Okay. So it drops it through the canopy, even though there's like stuff that would normally knock the drone off. So how long is that distance between the drone? Like, does it have?
I don't know how long it was, but my guess is it's probably 50 meters.
Okay, right. 'Cause you have to be above the canopy.
Yeah, you have to be above the canopy. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. And then, so it drops it down with a winch, it sucks it up, and then it just brings it back up.
So it doesn't actually carry the water back because it's super heavy, 40 kilos of water, but it just pumps through 40 liters of water, and there's a series of filters. And so as the water is moving through the filters, DNA gets, or other things, sediments and so on.
So you're literally doing the experiment like in situ there.
Yeah.
You take the filters back and then you analyze the filters.
Yeah. All the DNA sequencing and so on was done on the beach. Yeah. So we brought the filters back. We didn't do that part, but then there are teams of people. It was an all-female team from Virginia Tech, and they just got this, and then they were straight on the pipettes and, and extracting the DNA and sequencing it.
Okay. Because the filters are relatively light. You just have to run the water through it.
Exactly.
And then you take
it's like a coffee filter. You just go through.
Okay. And in that analysis, like do you have like a summary of what the DNA analysis?
I don't have it now, but I know that some of the highlights, we found river dolphins, jaguars, all sorts of birds, and
in that little creek thing.
Yeah, I think they had 27 million reads of DNA that they could identify to a certain taxon at different levels, and they identified hundreds of species.
That stream would have been a lot bigger. Like we saw this little picture; it looks like a little stream, but it's actually like big, or it connects to something big, so that. You said dolphins. Is that
river dolphins? Yeah, there are dolphins and
there's dolphins
in the river.
That little creek. Oh, I guess it's not a creek.
Well, I mean, DNA gets moved around, right? So,
right. Okay.
Yeah.
But
I don't know if there was a dolphin in that puddle. Probably not. But somehow, somehow they were able to amplify, river dolphin DNA. Yeah. So environmental DNA is all about you extract all of the pieces of DNA that are in the water. They can find them, and they can amplify them and sequence them and relate it to a particular sequence. That
was there like a much larger river nearby that you knew about?
Yeah, like the Amazon. Yeah.
How far away? But how far away was that?
It was about probably 20 Ks or something, maybe 10 Ks. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like
but the river that was there, the dolphins could move through, not in the forest where we were, but that river, that small river, is big enough that dolphins can move around. And then there's that the water where we sample is connected to that river. It's just it's like
for me it's interesting.
It's like a swamp.
The degree to which the canopy actually covers these different water. These stream sources of water. It seems.
Yeah, you could not see it on the image, but obviously the small river, the water level fluctuates a lot, and there has been actually quite a big drought in the Amazon before the competition. Like I don't know if you heard the mega drought in the Amazon. So the river, the water level was quite low, but not as low as it got lower a few months later. But when the water is higher, the river is, dolphins can swim through.
Cool.
All right.
Maybe I'll quickly take the question online. Just to summarize, so Bilal, what was the most decisive factor that led to achieving good results? Was it data pre-processing that was more critical, or having the right models, or so which component in the pipeline was the most important step?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think data is important, but really, and I tell him pretty often when I see him, but I think a lot of our success from the sub team that we did, it comes down to Hugo. I think Hugo did. I mean, Antoine as well, but Hugo worked really hard on this. The engineering and putting everything together. Obviously, it was a collective effort, but had we hired someone who was not as dedicated as Hugo, we only had a few months, I think it would have been difficult. Like he was working on weekends, he was working at night. During the competition, I stayed up and I was writing the report remotely. Hugo, it was 4 a.m. and we're sending stuff back, and I think he made a big difference. But that's but we could not achieve the results without all of the people that collected the data as well, and all of the people that contributed IDs and codes and so on. But at the end of the day, when we had to deliver something that worked on a laptop that could be sent in the Amazon, Hugo played a big role on that.
Sounds good. So one final question.
So is there any potential for ground vehicles for collecting more data? You talked about how people normally identify from the ground.
That's really interesting. Actually, there's one team that finished third that had this ground robot, and they invested a lot of effort. Actually, there are a number of people that had ground robots in Singapore. All of them, as far as I know, failed. It's a very complex environment. But I think some people still thought there was hope for ground robots. And this team is like this massive thing with wheels. But when they got to the competition, we were brought on this island, which is a beach. So there's the river, and then there was a big river just in between where we were supposed to land and the plot. And so the robot could not cross the river, and that was it for the robot. So they just invested a huge amount of effort, and they could never use it. So yeah, I think for tropical forests, it's so dense on the ground. There's so many obstacles, mud and lianas and things, and it would be very difficult, I think, to have. But we humans can do it, so maybe you could design a robot that could navigate through.
Maybe did any of them have quadrupeds?
Yeah, they tried that. From Boston Robotics, I've seen a modified one. I think one of the issues they had was range. Like one of the things they wanted us to do is to get as much, like go explore the whole 100 hectares, not just like a bit of it. And I think some of these robots, they were able to show that they could get in the forest, but they could not go as far as it was needed to achieve the sort of longer range monitoring that was required from the competition. Yeah.
At the beginning, I think you mentioned trap cameras. Did you try something like recording sounds from the jungle? Because I know that some biologists look into this, like to sample animals, birds.
Yeah, actually, sorry. So I didn't talk. I talked more about the part that we did, which is the trees. But there's a lot of other things. So the bioacoustic work that we did in the team. All the teams use bioacoustics, but the people that identify birds in this environment, like the bird guides we work with from Ecuador, they use their ears, right? So we had microphones. I think we had 90 microphones on these rafts that we deployed on top of the trees. And a lot of people did bioacoustics very well. So, you just take the data, and then the challenge was to get a model that worked well for the species that were there. We did not really do that part ourselves. We worked with people from Cornell and that do the Merlin app for and the model for identifying birds. And so they helped us with that. We helped them we got them some data that the people from Ecuador, we got a lot of label data, and in return, the Cornell people helped us with a fine-tuned model that included these species. But one of the really cool things we did with bioacoustics is actually a professor from University of Sherbrooke who is actually, the research that he was doing is more to intercept drones that are flying over a prison. So if you think about, drone delivery of drugs or weapons and so on, people do take drones. You're not allowed to, of course, but you drop something and then you take off. And it's very difficult for them to intercept these drones. So what they've designed is to have a network of microphones that could hear the drone hovering, and they're able, through triangulation of the sound, to locate the precise location so that they can intercept. So he was working on that problem, and he was pretty advanced. And we actually adapted it to birds. And so we were able to locate the individual birds, like the parrots that would sing and move around or fight with each other. And we could, with triangulation of these bird sound, track the individual birds and then see on which trees it's landed. And so that spatial localization of birds through sound was very innovative. But that's all I know about it. You'd have to ask the professor in Sherbrooke.
All right, I think we will stop here. So let's thank the speaker again once.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And sorry, the Zoom people, for all the glitches. Apologize.